The MINIS range is one of the longer running current Thomas & Friends toy ranges, lasting for 11 years as of 2026. One of the main gimmicks of this range is the high number of different paint jobs that each engine is released in, with each wave featuring different paint jobs for different characters. As can be expected of a toy line that has lasted this long, there have been many alternate paint jobs over the years. Sometimes I wonder how these paint jobs would look when applied to the engines in a more realistic form. So today we're going to look at 3 different paint jobs and draw the Thomas characters wearing them. I decided to start with a fairly simple one, the Racing Thomas livery. The MINIS range has had a number of different themes during its run, and the racers are one of the more prolific examples. Compared to certain other paint schemes, the Racing Thomas is a bit more believable as a livery, even if it would probably make more sense as a livery on a car versus a locomotive. I decided that, since this is a racing livery, it would make sense to show Thomas racing Bertie. I don't suppose that painting Thomas into a new livery would make him any faster, but it would probably take Bertie by surprise at the very least. He's expecting nothing out of the ordinary, and here comes Thomas in a completely different paint job. I wanted to evoke a countryside setting, as if Thomas hurtling along in his racing livery is breaking the peace and tranquility in a single burst. I'll admit that this is one of those types of videos where there isn't a huge amount to talk about, although I suppose I could fill up the dead air by talking about my opinion on the Thomas MINIS range, since I've always been a bit mixed about it. This is probably just a me thing, but I've never been one for non-standard variants of existing characters in merchandise lines. Generally, I'd rather have a representation of a character as they appear in the source material, as opposed to a custom colour scheme that only appears as a toy, or only briefly appears in the source material. Something like LBSC Thomas or Black James I don't mind too much, since there is a story-based reason for those liveries to exist, but I never cared much for, say, Yellow Rheneas, which only appears in the show as part of a post-credits scene, which I'm 90% sure was meant for Duncan. And the majority of MINIS variants are completely original liveries that never appear in the show at all. Having said that, I would say that a lot of the liveries are well done, and it certainly beats what a lot of other blind toy ranges do, where they just make variants by casting the design as solid colour without painting it. That's not to say that the MINIS didn't have crap variants as well, mind. The old school theme, which consists of grayscale renditions of the characters, strikes me as not particularly imaginative or exciting, particularly as one of the characters they chose was Spencer, who was already grey. But with that said, here is the finished drawing. The next variant I wanted to cover was the Neon Percy. There were a handful of Neon MINIs released over the years, but Percy's looked the most interesting in my opinion. For Percy's Neon variant, the designers went with the tartan or plaid style. Tartan is something I typically associate with Scotland, but whilst there are a number of Scottish Thomas & Friends characters, for some reason none of them made it into the MINIS range. I guess this is validating if you headcanon Percy to be a Caledonian pug. I had to include Donald and Douglas in the drawing somewhere. My thinking is that Percy had probably overheard the twins talking about how different tartan designs are linked to different Scottish families and clans. Percy is intrigued and figured that, even if it happened a long time ago, those tartan designs would have had to have been thought up by someone. So if he thought up his own tartan, surely it would be just as valid as the one spanning hundreds of years. He went to the paint shop at the Sodor Steamworks and picked colours and shades that he could quite confidently say hadn't been used together for a tartan before. When Percy returned to the sheds resplendent in his new neon tartan livery, the twins were dazzled. Percy's new paint job was not terribly pleasing to the eye. The railwaymen didn't like it either. It was so uneasy on the eyes that it put them off their work, causing them to make mistakes. This all came to a head when a signalman, dazzled by Percy's livery, ended up switching him onto the wrong line, resulting in Percy running through a set of buffers and coming off the tracks. The Fat Controller spoke severely to Percy and ordered him to go back to the works to get painted into his usual colour scheme. Percy meekly obliged, and there was no more talk about tartan, at least not when Percy was around. Getting the tartan to look right in this drawing was a bit of a challenge. You might notice that at one point I ended up drawing the diagonal lines in the wrong direction in some spots, and so I had to go back and change it. I decided to use a separate multiply layer to shade Percy, as trying to shade the tartan on the same layer was not going to happen, I can assure you that. However, with all that said and done, here is the completed version of the art. Toby has a fair share of liveries to choose from, including Neon, Gingerbread House and Sugar Daddy. But in the end I decided to represent Toby with the Robo variant. The Robo theme was an early Minis theme, and with the exception of Millie, the engines that made up the theme were given a vaguely steampunk style. I know that steampunk styling is certainly a bit contentious. There's a right way to do it and a wrong way. The general rule when it comes to making or drawing something in a steampunk style is not to just place cogs willy-nilly. On one hand, I can see how the Minis Robo Toby kinda falls into this category, but on the other hand, I kinda like how they pulled it off. It almost looks like the inside of an old clock. No, I'm not sure how Toby's crew is supposed to enter his cab either. I try to add a bit of logic to the design by giving Toby a vertical cylinder with a rod connecting to the rear set of wheels. Not that you can see them, since it's covered by his side plates. Truthfully, I probably could have omitted the side plates, since the original toy doesn't have them either. But then again, none of the Toby Minis had side plates, so I don't think that the Robo variant is specifically trying to depict Toby without them. Speaking of Toby without side plates, I'm still a bit disappointed with the fact that the new reboot diecast Toby doesn't have side plates, especially since he looks pretty good aside from that. Considering Toby is basically just a box, I'm not entirely sure why Mattel struggles so much with his merchandise. I can predict that the sales of grey plasticard will see an increase this year. Going back to the subject of steampunk, I'm reminded of when Hornby attempted to make a steampunk range. I appreciate that we need new methods of getting more people into the hobby of model trains, but I can also see why the range didn't do very well. As well as invoking what I mentioned earlier about randomly shoving cogs into places where they don't belong, I would imagine that if people wanted to make a steampunk model railway, they'd be more likely to want to build their own engines and rolling stock to custom designs. Meanwhile, someone who just wants to buy a model train is probably going to want engines and rolling stock that just look like, well, trains. Anyway, it's kind of pointless to talk about it now, since the Hornby steampunk range has been discontinued for a while. And whilst I could do with seeing fewer Beatles trains, I think Hornby's other attempts to bring new people into the hobby have been much better thought out. And so, here is the completed illustration. And there we are, 3 alternate liveries from the Thomas & Friends Minis range, applied to the regular versions of those characters. It's been interesting to draw liveries that trains wouldn't typically wear and I'm not used to drawing. Let me know if you'd like to see more videos like this one. There are so many Thomas Mini variants that I could probably make dozens of videos in the same vein as this one, and maybe cover some of the more cursed variants. Either way, be sure to leave a like, a comment, and make sure you're subscribed.